Hello and welcome to this episode of Resourceful Women. Today I get to speak with Anna Hicken, and it's going to be a really good conversation. I know Anna from real life as well as professional life. And before we get started, I just want to invite listeners to share, like, and subscribe, and that'll help us get our stories to people who want to know more about women in mining. So, Anna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lynnel.
It's so nice to chat with you. If we want to start, the beginning's often a good place. So we can start with, how did you get into mining and when did you know that that was something that you wanted to do?
Sure. I think, for me, it started way back to really my childhood. I grew up in Southern Ontario, but, in an area where they had a lot of drumlin fields. And that started really my love of rocks and, understanding some of the landscape and the geomorphology and always like science, but, geology and mining is such a nice mix of different aspects of science all coming together. And, there's an art and science to everything that we do. So I really, really like that. Going into university, I feel like I was one of the few that went right into geology at Carleton, and had a really good time there. It's a small school, but has pumped out some great geologists as well. And then from there, went into grad school at Queen's. And I think really at Queen's, it's when we started to, maybe introduce a little bit more of the mining side of things. Along with some of the field work that I'd done in the summers as a student, working in BC, the Yukon, and in Nunavut as well. And that's really where, I got my love of, doing field work, but also understanding the science of it. When I graduated, I had initially thought, I never want to work in a mine. I just only want to, be a research scientist for the GSC or something like that. But, very quickly realized that, to get a good basis of understanding, you need to have a really varied background. So, spent a couple of years in Nunavut with Sabina Gold and Silver at their Back River deposit, and then, moved over to Gold Corp in Red Lake. And that's really where I started to understand, all the aspects of mining and how, what we do in exploration really does affect what you're seeing, right at the face as they're mining that ore. And I, really got a great sort of mentorship there. And, that's where I met Maura, who I work with at Dryden Gold as well. And, it's really understanding sort of all of those aspects coming together that really, really interested me initially. Then from there, did a little bit on the finance side, but really got back into the exploration side because, that's really what, I think we can add the most value. And I think even from my sort of 15-year career have found and seen a lot of changes. Really when I started, I feel like it was rare to have, even another female field partner out there. But, when we were started to get into the Gold Corp realm of things, we were pretty much a 50-50 sort of department there at the end with about, I'd say about 40 to 60 geos at a time. So
That's
I think things are
amazing.
really changing, which is great.
That is amazing because achieving that 50-50, I think, is almost unheard of. I think you were in kind of a special spot for that. And I love to hear that it happened because, so often if you say a geologist, who do we think of, right? We think of
Absolutely.
we think of a guy walking with a stick and a lot of beard, right? But that's just not
Yes.
the case.
Yes. Yes. No, absolutely. I think, the younger generation, I would say it's pretty much 50-50 or even like 60-40 nowadays. And, I still all the alumni events, PDAC and things like that, you see a really good, diversity, not only in gender, but in, backgrounds of people coming from other countries as well. So, I think we're really trying to, increase that diversity, but, the best teams are made up of people of all different backgrounds and, the best geos have seen lots of different rocks. So I think building teams with that in mind is, really important to me.
When you said it started, and I mean, I agree, it's so important. And, diversity of background, diversity of thought, diversity in gender, diversity in, I would even say, stage of life. I think that's important too. You did mention
Hmm.
generations. There are some youngins and some older ones as well.
Hmm.
When you mentioned you were at 15, so I would say you're definitely past early career kinds of things. I'd say you're in the thick of it as far as, career goes. And you said you noticed some changes in the industry. And is it a change in the industry or how companies are behaving, or is it a change at the educational level? Like, where do you think the change started?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I think it is a change in how companies are being run. I think for us, it's a change somewhat in technology as well. Just being able to contact people easier. With our latest drill programs, we have a Starlink right at the drill, which is, even a couple years ago was unheard of. And then, changes in how we look at data that I think has really sort of impacted a lot of our exploration goals going forward. And I think, in terms of some of the diversity pieces, I think it's just really a change in the overall sort of global mining atmosphere. I think there's a lot more outreach of mining in terms of, at the education level in schools, but also just in sort of the general knowledge of people and, their backgrounds and where they grew up. So I think it is a variety of factors, but, education being an important one of those.
When you think back to your geo class, what do you think the distribution was between the young men and the young women who were interested in geology?
Yeah, I mean, my undergrad class was fairly small. I think there was only about four of us that graduated. So that one was maybe not the best example, but I know in grad school, we
Insufficient
were,
sample size.
yeah, yeah. It wasn't statistically significant, I don't think. But, in grad school, I think there was definitely, you know, more males and females. But, I think one was interesting, at least in my class, was there are very few people from Canada in my class. There was a lot of like South American people who would come up. So, it was a great way to have a better understanding of some of that diversity of background with having a lot of American students and a lot of South American students. But, when we were TAing, a lot of the undergrad classes were pretty much like a 50-50. Even as we were veering into the mining engineering side, because I did TA some of those classes as well. So, I think, in the next little bit in leadership roles, we are going to see a big change just because those people are now, gaining more experience and growing in their careers.
That's excellent to hear, and really nice to get a peek into that educational piece as well. I think often in the industry we can overlook it, and we tend not to hear too much about the education part of it until we get to the big conferences and hear about mining schools and everything else. But when you went through, you were, if I can call it, pure geo.
Um, Actually, I did a double major in my undergrad with geology and physical geography. So a little bit of both, but it really set me up well for, I'd say, exploration specifically, because a lot of what we do is looking at like soil data or how land forms, glaciology. So looking back, it was a really good choice for me, and integrating some of those other pieces together was really helpful.
Yeah, you could have a career in mining with that.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I mean, it was really good. I mean, looking back, one thing that I do wish that I had more exposure to was the mining side in school. Just understanding some more of like the mining economics and things like that. Because that what I went through was more so on the engineering side than on the like science side. But there's a lot of exposure that you can get, either through the workplace or, through taking short courses and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting when I look at people who went through mining engineering or who went through programs that were designed to land people directly into careers in mining. There aren't enough of those people to fully populate all of the mining companies that are around. So I kind of like that you came from a slightly different angle. I mean, I think you're amazingly educated and to do the work that you're doing. And that's something that I think about a lot when I think about people coming into the mining industry, if the industry is attractive to them, and looking at those kinds of things. So I'm curious how you chose geology instead of mining. Like, did you have mining in mind when you started your education, or were you just convinced that geology was what you wanted to do?
You know what? I think for me, I was really, focused on the geology. And I think it was really just because I had a lack of exposure to the mining side.
Mhm.
Especially growing up in Southern Ontario, there's just not a lot of exposure to mining in that region.
Mhm.
And looking back, I think there would probably been a strong possibility that I would have, taken some sort of mining engineering degree instead of geology if I had that exposure. Not that I obviously regret anything, but I can see the benefit. And I'm a pretty analytical person, so I can see how, I could have found a happy career there as well.
I like that too because it shows, there are a lot of different paths that we could have taken, and and there are a lot of things that would have been good. And I know just from, as I said, knowing you in life, I know that you really do love your career and the places that it takes you and the things that you get to do. What would be like one of your favorite days at work? Like what day you kind of get up and clap your hands together and you're like, ooh, today I get to, what's that kind of day for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I do like about this industry is every day is very different. So, it keeps you definitely on your toes. But, I think for me, I really enjoyed, when I was working at Gold Corp and you could spend, say, like the morning looking at core or looking at like a model in 3D. And then, in the afternoon, go down and actually physically have a look at it underground. I think that really helped me, really put together what we're seeing on the surface, in a drill core, into that 3D model, but then to see it in real life, because, the detail that we get in those models, while is good, it's just, not a substitute for when you're actually, walking through your model underground. And, I think people who haven't worked in a mining scenario where you can see that, it's just hard to sort of fathom because, we spend so much of our time and energy working on these 3D models, which go into our resources, which are very important. But, to see even the more complexity, and, Red Lake, I would say is, one of the more complex deposits out there. But, seeing that detail underground and, having a more appreciation for it, I really, really enjoyed. And then, on the flip side, mentoring some of the younger geos, that's something that, I always tried to really focus on. I think that's a really important aspect, as we're, going along in our career to help the younger generation, help the, junior geologists break into the industry and to really foster that sort of collaborative relationship.
I mean, I couldn't agree anymore. I always think that mining is currently, I would say, populated by an older generation. And one of the topics at conferences is always how do we appeal to a younger generation? And when we look at that, I think mentoring plays a huge part in that. And especially, as you say, coming from a geology perspective, to actually get to physically crawl in to the inside of your models, I think that would be, pretty fun for someone who's keen on rocks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's kind of mind blowing, really, because,
Yeah.
you can see it on the computer, but like when you can, put those two together, it is, I highly recommend it.
And how do we spot these people who have the interest? Did you have, favorite rocks when you were a kid?
I mean, I think for me, maybe not favorite rock so much, but I had a like real interest in like how a lot of like these like glacial landforms originally formed. Just really due to where I grew up, and we had a drumlin that was sort of in the back of our property. And I always just wondered, like, why is it more like a teardrop shape, like what happened. And, just having that understanding, really interested me. And, both my parents are scientists, so I think it was sort of like a natural fit, I'd say, for me as well. And, it's a nice balance between, really analytical science, but also, um, in geology, we basically never know the answer fully. So it is very much like an artistic interpretation as well. And I think it really appeases sort of both sides of my brain that way.
Yeah, you get to build up intuition with all of the data you see, and I think, there is some, you're almost saying that it's imagination, but to me, it's also an amazing command of visualization and spatial understanding of
Mhm.
things as well, and getting to hold all of those things together at the same time.
Absolutely.
It makes me curious on this is not meant to be like a hard-hitting journalist question, but what is your take on an AI interpretation of these geological models?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a great question, especially with the rise again of AI. I think AI has a spot in mining and exploration, but it's basically should be used as another data layer. I think really where that AI could help us is to look through a large amount of data quickly, where that we do struggle with that, just due to some of the limitations that we have with computing power sometimes. I think one of the drawbacks is, and I mean, it's a human drawback as well, but, you know, we only have data where we can sort of see data. We have a lot of paper data that's really useful, that's not digitized, that, is sitting in old boxes, which is, very, very relevant and useful too, which,
I
a
hadn't
lot of those
even
AI machines wouldn't be able to pick up.
That's very cool. I hadn't even thought of the legacy data, and that's such an important part of exploration and mining projects and everything else, is understanding the work that has been done before the companies change over, the properties change hands numbers and
Absolutely.
numbers of times. And, there are always stories about, the legacy data and everything else. And that's that's something that hadn't occurred to me before, is that pouring through all of that paper is
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, geology is like a little bit different than a lot of sciences because, the historic data is like still very, very relevant to us. Like,
Mhm.
we're not like in the medical field where, things have changed so drastically since like the 1900s that it might not be relevant anymore.
Right.
All that data is very, very useful. And, when I was at Goldcorp, I was part of that IBM Watson project. And, that was a big part of the project, was actually digitizing that paper data so it could be used in the AI. Because, sure, a lot of people have said this, but, garbage in, garbage out, if they don't have all the information, then,
Yeah.
the AI tool is not very useful.
And what do you think about the aspect of having to teach the AI? Like, was that part of the project as well?
Yeah, I mean, we had a little bit of a different focus because, like, we did have a training data set there, but, a lot of geology where we try to fit it into these deposit models and these different boxes. Like each deposit is still unique in their own way. So we were trying to create an AI system there that didn't specifically have like a large training data set that was external to it because like if you look regionally and globally, there isn't really a deposit exactly like Red Lake out there that could be used for training. So geology is like a little bit more complex in that sense to use for AI,
Mhm.
because again, it sort of goes back to our earlier discussion where, there's a lot of interpretation, and we're not really using like zeros and ones, like, like engineering, or something like that, where it's a little bit more focused and easy to understand.
I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of the industry too, is when, if you look back into the story of these different finds, where I'm up in Yellowknife and I've read the story of the diamond discovery. And to say there's a lot of interpretation in that is to put it very lightly. It was
Mhm.
a very intuitive fascinating story about following the glaciation, as you said, and looking for things in that manner. One thing I know from just previous conversations with you and with Maura is that your amount of data to classify the deposit that you have is amazing. Like your drill programs are very targeted and answering questions that you're coming up with. So in that way, I know that when you're leading exploration, what do you lean into as far as, what your teams need to know and need to do to get that information?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Maura and I are both really focused on having a geoscience-driven approach to our exploration. So, making sure that we're looking at all that information that we have. But then again, like using our backgrounds as well. So, working at different deposits, hiring people that have, different backgrounds, can really help, see patterns, or see trends that previous operators didn't necessarily see. We do have the benefit, again, talking about some of the technology and the AI pieces of being able to look at more data together, which I think really does help. But it's really integrating all those pieces of data together, coming up with interpretations, and then testing those interpretations. But I think again, seeing what works and what doesn't, and changing your interpretations and your methodology, quickly or on the fly is also really useful. So, even for the drill program that we're drilling right now with Dryden Golds, like we have everything planned out, but it is really dependent on what we're seeing in each hole, and we actually adjust each hole, sort of on the fly based on what we see, rather than drilling say like an infill program where you're maybe more so looking at drill hole spacing than the geology specifically. These deposits can be very structurally controlled, so taking that aspect into consideration, but also using all of the tools that we have available. So a lot of the geochemistry, 3D modeling, historic data. It's really a lot of compilation and interpretation.
Yeah, and you were mentioning too, you have the Starlink. So how does the speed of accessing your data, how does that influence your ability to move ahead?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I think that is an absolute game changer. Something as simple as being able to get survey data immediately. So the drillers can do a downhole survey, send it to us right away. We can plot it up in 3D, and then it helps us make decisions on do we want to extend holes, do we want to adjust holes, do we want to add holes to this setup? And before we would have to send a surveyor out there, they'd have to do the survey, come back, do a lot of that QA/QC, and then we'd eventually get it. But there's been a lot of changes with how the survey data and tools and how easy they are to use. But then being able to get that data immediately is very, very useful, super useful.
It sounds useful and it sounds efficient as well. Like I know I am not a miner, which I always say. But to me, when you have the people there and they're ready to go, being able to get them answers about what comes next or if you're going to make a change, to me, that seems like a really efficient use of drill crews and mobilization and the seasons. So
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah, it allows us to be to like way more dynamic than we used to be. And it's really simply based on the Starlink and survey data and Leapfrog. I'd say we can get things going really quickly.
I mean, I think that's, as you said, it's game changing. And I think your connection then to the data and to the project would be a lot more immediate. And I think it would add kind of an element of urgency to it as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You need to know your stuff so you can plan the next moves as they're going on. But I believe it's all come together and given you, you and your team and in your company a lot of great information to look at and look at the whole thing. So when you dive down into the details, you're really prepared, and it sounds like, that aspect of bringing everything together is an important part of the exploration. When I was talking with Maura, she said that she had some mentors in the industry, and you mentioned that it's great working with her as well. When you look at the industry, do you have any, challenge flags that you look at, you're like, oh, that could be a lot better, just from the perspective of being a woman in mining, or just the industry as well? Like, where do you think the industry could go as far as, making careers for women?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, I think I've been to a lot of talks and things that, especially early in people's career, there's, a lot more women, and then they tend to drop off, after, say, 10, 15 years. So I think that there is still a lot of work that we have to do to retain women in the industry. And I think a lot of that has to do, with the travel aspect, having sort of benefits for healthcare, childcare, all of that. And I think, as, a generation comes up with more women, that will be a focus going forward, because, you know, these qualified people for these roles just happen to also, be female or have a different background and have different needs. So, I think we've come a long way since I started, even 15 years ago, in terms of some of the diversity, as well as safety. I think that was a big one as well. With the technology, just having like a lot more safety procedures in place, which, I think lends a greater comfort for people in the field as well. But I think that there's, always more work that we can do going forward. I do think it starts, with high school students and university students, because I think if we miss the boat to get people interested in mining, then it really changes sort of the progression of their career if they sort of miss that main education piece and have to go back later.
So those entry points are interesting notions, when we look at any industry and any career. And I'm hearing a lot about, or in what you say, I'm picking out the notion that there are windows that we have, for attracting people to the industry, and also windows for keeping them. And I think that's
Yes.
an interesting notion as well. So when it comes to retention, that one really gets me thinking, because, if I think back, I'm like, I don't know what would I have needed to be able to work remotely and that sort of thing. So it's
Hmm.
it's interesting, and I try my very best not to ask the question that men don't get asked. But I have been hearing more and more men being asked the question, how are you making this work for family? And I love that men are getting that question as well. It's not just the women, and it might be a matter of me being tuned to it a little bit more, because I always thought that, just societally, we need to ask more of those questions of men as well. Like,
Absolutely.
how are you making this work?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I think, there's been a lot of, changing in traditional roles, and, a lot of families are, it's both parents are working, you know, and they both have to make it work. So I agree. I think, it's sort of the changing of those opinions as well, going forward. Because I do think it's, becoming much more common, for either parent to stay home, or if it's a, same-sex couple that, obviously one of them, you know, could potentially stay at home with a child, or something like that.
Yeah. And two, I'm interested in just looking at the overall time, and I've touched on it with a few different guests as well, but just how you make it work. And I don't think it's so much about being a mom in mining as it is, I think maybe the better question is, how do we be parents and miners at the same time, and how do we make all of those things work together? So,
I
and
agree.
and I know you're on the brink of figuring that out in real time. So
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, I think, yeah, that's something that, I'm going to be coming across very, very soon. And, I think it is an interesting situation because my husband's also a geologist. So, two geologists sort of having, a similar sort of background and work schedule and, having to make that work. And, I'd say that we have definitely not figured out everything yet. But, I think what is nice is, we do have, supportive companies that we work for. And, with really the ability during COVID to show that people can work remotely. I think that there's a lot more flexibility in these roles where, one of us wouldn't have to leave a role to be able to stay home with a child.
yeah, I think that's as trying as those times were, I think we learned a lot about how work can be. And I think it put different pressures on people in different roles and everything else. So I'm getting the message from our tech here that we are running very short on time. So I don't want to cut you off. I'll say thank you so much for sharing your take on the industry. And really, when I hear you talking about it, it's you're sciencing every day, but now you're also financing every day. And you're looking at teams and all the different aspects that you get to touch on. I know that various aspects of your story are going to resonate with listeners as considering the industry, considering the working relationships that exist inside it, as well as the physical aspects of it and keeping up with tech. So thank you so much, Anna. It was a pleasure, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Okay, thank you, Lynnel.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Resourceful Women is a product of the Prospector News. Opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and speaker alone. Resourceful Women is for educational and entertainment purposes, and nothing in the podcast should be taken as investment advice. Always consult with a licensed personal financial advisor before making any investment purchases.